Hey everyone, this is Levi from Truth Beauty Comics, and I'm really excited to tell you about my new comic called Open Your Eyes. So, Open Your Eyes is a modern retelling of the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale, and it's appropriate for young adults and up. If you enjoy a lot of the themes and comics we talk about on our podcast, then I think you'll like it. So here's the deal. I've already written and drawn the first issue, but I need to raise money to fund the printing, so I'm doing a Kickstarter campaign. Open Your Eyes is officially launching on Kickstarter on July 14th, and that means we have 30 days to fund the printing of the new issue. If you'd like to support the printing and get your own copy, go to Kickstarter.com and search for Open Your Eyes. In the late 1980s, Jeff Smith, a young animator, was unsatisfied with working at a small animation studio. During a slow period, he decided to revisit a story filled with characters that he'd been drawing since childhood. A comic that combined his love of fantasy, comedy, and adventure. A comic that told an epic story with a beginning, middle, and end. In 1991, he self-published the first issue of Bone, the first of 55 issues that would go on to be hailed as the best all-ages graphic novel yet published. Today on Truth, Beauty, and Comics. Welcome to Truth Beauty Comics. I'm Levi, a cartoonist.
And I'm Felix, a guy who likes comics.
And this is the podcast where we look for transcendence in a pulpy medium. And today we're going to be talking about Jeff Smith's epic graphic novel, indie graphic novel, Bone. And we'll be specifically talking about the first two issues and also just kind of our general experience of reading Bone and kind of growing up with that. As always, you can look at the show notes on our Patreon, which will have some images from the comic we're discussing. I think you mentioned that this was an important comic for you too, Felix, and I think it was for me as well. And I've included in the show notes I still remember this. It's kind of a long story, but when I was a kid,
go ahead and tell it. I'm interested to hear.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, this was like in kind of the mid '90s. There was like I was a homeschooled kid. There was a lot, but it was a very creative group that I was a part of. And so like all the older homeschool kids that were like seniors in high school, they were publishing a zine called Bitter Stamps. And if you don't know what zines are, you can Google them. They were really cool. And in it, they like basically included like every comic that I still love to this day. So they would review stuff like from Paul Pope, from they had Dave Sim comics they would talk about there. So it was all this kind of indie comic stuff that was they would talk a lot about in this zine. And I remember they reviewed Bone, and they included like a photocopy of this page where kind of from I think the Dragon Slayer are part of the story where Lucius is going through the woods looking for Rose and Thorn. And I just remember looking at this image and going like, what is that? Like everything about it appealed to me. Just the use, the way it was drawn, the character, the weird, like kind of little bone characters. And I just was like fascinated by it. And I still to this day, it must have been like 11 or 12 years old, remember that exactly the page it was, because it made such a big impression on me seeing that. And I was so drawn to it. And was kind of hooked reading Bone ever since that. But what was your first encounter with Bone? Do you remember?
So, as a child, I was also homeschooled. Sorry, weird podcast. And I would hang around the library a lot, as homeschool kids often do. And so this was early 2000s. I was born in 92, so I think I was probably about 11 or 12, so it was probably 2002, 2003, something like that. And at that time, right now you go into any library in the country and there are tons of comics and graphic novels. At that time, at least our little tiny local library in a small town had virtually no comics. I think they had sort of one shelf, not meaning like shelf, meaning like one line of books. And so I would always look at those. And they had gotten the first 2 volumes, I think. So I pulled Bone out from Boneville, like, oh, this is intriguing. And I got it out and started reading it. I think it was in the evening. And I just read it cover to cover. It was I was enjoying it, right? Like it's fun, especially, for those who either haven't read it before and are reading along with us and have just read the first two chapters. It's sort of light and fun, and the story gets more involved over time. But I was enjoying it, but I was also just really intrigued. And the thing that really stuck out to me, because I'd read a lot of comics before, but I think Bone was probably the first comic that I read where I really became aware of the cartoonist as an artist who's making a lot of very careful decisions.
Hmm.
Just
Yeah.
like particularly, so I think at the end of the last Fantastic Four episode, when we were saying what we would do next, I think I specifically recommended people get the black and white edition, and
Right.
and I think it's not just nostalgia for me. I'm really genuinely very glad that I was first exposed to the black and white, because while the color is fine, I think the black and white is a much sort of I think the level of artistry in it is much clearer. Um, because you get pages like, so in the sort of I'm using the huge Bone one volume edition, and I'm just thinking of like page 21 when the locusts come, just the use of blacks. Like you would just have whole panels that were mostly black, and then you've got some bugs and the outline of phone bone, these sorts of things, just the
Yeah.
way that it sort of it's just so evocative, with basically just two colors, right? You've got white and you've got
Right.
black. um there's really no shading to be spoken of. Occasionally you'll get really thin lines that almost feel like a different color, but other than that, right, but it really is just two colors. And I think that, like, I just found that sort of almost, I mean, it was like captivating. It was almost hypnotic. um so I next week got the second out, and then they didn't have a couple of them, and so I got interlibrary loans. It was a whole thing, and finally,
Right.
I get to the end of it, and I got the last one. I was very thankful because someone else had it out, and it came back just in time for us to go to our annual family camp. And so we got up there, and I just read the whole thing.
Yeah.
um and and I mean, well, our hope is to eventually work through the whole of Bone, and so we'll get to that. But my experience of that, sort of being surrounded by natural beauty, and what goes on at the end, just was very powerful to me, sort of as like
Hmm.
a 12 or 13-year-old. And so Bone is my favorite graphic novel.
Hmm.
I think probably I probably read it more than just about anything else. I'm sure there are some Calvin and Hobbes books or Tintin books that I had as a kid I read more. But certainly in terms of anything over, let's say, 400 pages, um,
Right.
most of them I've read maybe one or two or three times. This I've probably read a dozen times. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's sort of
Yeah.
my kind of
I,
starting point with it.
yeah, I agree with you. I think for some reason, to me, I've always been really drawn to black and white art. Even like Maxfield Parrish, we haven't talked about him, but he, like, my favorite art of Maxfield Parrish is his black and white work, and I don't really know why. I mean, maybe it was because I grew up reading newspaper comics and they're all in black and white. But I actually think it's really, I think with art, there's something about when you're doing black and white artwork that it allows, it's like giving you just enough information to fill in with your imagination, right? It somehow makes things more real by by giving you less details. So it
Yeah.
engages your imagination a little bit more. But when done, and I really do think Smith, one of the things I love about his art is he's drawing on a different tradition than superhero comics, like, very clearly. Like, his major influences are, like, just clearly Karl Barks. Like, it's the Bone characters are almost like fan art of the Ducks in some ways, in their proportions and the way they move and stuff like that. And so Karl Barks, but he's also, Milt Caniff, with his use of blacks, and And so there's a really different tradition than the not what was going on in superhero comics. They really seem to have diverged. And just even yeah. So I think this really appealed to me much more than anything else that you would find like at a comic book store. Just because it was so much more within what I loved about the comics that came from newspapers rather than kind of the superhero world.
And I think part of the real magic of Bone is the integration of very sort of cartoony characters, right? The Bone, the three Bone brothers, in this highly detailed world with very realistic human characters and physically realistic. Right. And one other influence that I always knew but struggled with, sort of like, we when we talked about Crazy Cat, I talked about how I always, like, as a kid, a few times I tried to read it because I knew that a lot of cartoonists that I loved were influenced by it. But when I went back to it, every time I tried, I just found it confusing and hard work.
Right.
And one that was a bit like that for me until recently is Walt Kelly's Pogo, because that was a huge influence on Smith, which I knew from reading a few interviews. And I went back and the characters in Pogo have their own sort of strange dialects and things, and sometime we should cover Pogo. I think it's a great strip, but it had these very how do I describe it? Sort of I mean, so it was animal characters, and the protagonist was Pogo, and I'm trying to remember what kind of an animal he technically was, but
it's a possum, right?
Possum, that's it, yeah. Right. And he had these sort of this soft, circular, sort of cutesy face that's really similar to the faces of the three Bone brothers. And I think I think the way, like, Bone is, for me, a really excellent example of the way that great artists exist within traditions, right, and with relationships to older works of art. So the kind of like standard text that people refer to here as T.S. Eliot's tradition and the individual talent, which I won't attempt to summarize here because it's too it's a very like thoughtful, careful work that I haven't read in several years. But one thing that when I first read it, it really encouraged me to grapple with is the way that great works are, like, the men and women who make great works of art are deeply formed by older traditions, but somehow they use them to make something new, even though it is sort of like you put Karl Barks and Walt Kelly and J.R.R. Tolkien in a blender, you get Bone. But even now that I'm older and I've read many of his influences, Bone is still, like, it still feels almost sui generis. And I think that's something like really magical about like genuinely great artists and writers, that they're able to simultaneously take in so much and be so formed by it while making something that is really just does things that nothing else quite does. And I think Bone does that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that is, I think, one of the, if you're a fan of comics, specifically a certain tradition of comics, what makes Bone so enjoyable reading is it has that at once very grounded feel to it. It's but at the same time it's original. It's something different. It's not really I'm trying to think if there's anyone who if there's anything really like it. And there's there's a lot of people who have tried to do things like, I think of like Liberty Meadows was a strip that kind of had similar, where you had like this really attractive girl with kind of like weird little sidekick characters and stuff. I never really read that comic, but I've seen the artwork floating around. But there's not anything that did this kind of epic scope. It's interesting. So I think, one of the quotes that I found from Smith talking about it was he was always searching for the kind of like 1,000-page Uncle Scrooge story when he was a kid, like that. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of what he wrote here. Is like he took like these characters, but he put them in at like the Lord of the Rings more is kind of what he did, and it's a really wonderful result. And it is a shame. I wish more kids were exposed to the black and white version, because I do think I would say you could probably maybe a really masterful colorist could color Bone and do a good job. I think the color job that they did is really mediocre to me too, which is a shame. It just looks like the mid 2000s Image Comics like standard color palette or something. I don't know. It just doesn't work for me at all.
And I think even if it were, I mean, so I've only read bits and pieces of the colored version, because anytime I try it feels off to me. But I do think it's something where even if it had been colored just exquisitely well, it was not, like, the art was not intended to be colored initially.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, so we'll get more into sort of the history of Bone and its author, Jeff Smith, because it's a really interesting story. Probably next episode or maybe the one after that. But, I'll just say that the black and white were how it was originally published, and then when it was acquired by Scholastic, which has been huge for making it one of the best-selling graphic novel series of all time, because Scholastic Book Fairs with Bone Comics, you do the math, which is great because it gets this amazing story into people's hands. But I feel about it similarly to how I feel about how so many people have only seen the special edition Star Wars,
right?
Where you have CGI that, like, whether or not you like the CGI or whether or not you like any of the changes, it does profoundly change aspects of, especially episode 4 and episode 6. And again, even if you like them, there's something really powerful about the sort of art as originally made. And I think Bone is that way, where, I mean, I just opened to a random page here, right? Page 277, which we did not read for today. But
right, yeah.
You just get that, most of this page is black with stars and a rat creature, and it just has this kind of melancholy to it. But then also there's humor to it. And somehow I find it more evocative in black and white than I do in the color. Yeah, and I think there's.
I agree. I think there's
I'm now flipping through and I'm getting off track.
No, it's what always bothers me about the, especially black and white artists, when people go to color their work, and it always detracts from it, because what you end up doing is you're adding shadows and midtones and light sources to that just weren't there in the original artwork. And like a good black and white artist is thinking through all those things when they're coloring. They're setting kind of the values that they're making these decisions in a black and white world. And then it's like the colorist is this totally different person, and it's like they just kind of blandify everything in my mind. It doesn't add anything to it, and in many ways it really detracts from the kind of the simplicity and the clarity of the story. So I think it's a shame that it's not more widely distributed in black.
And there are a lot of older comics where the artist, the penciler and the colorist didn't necessarily communicate very much. But in those cases, at the very least, the penciler was intentionally penciling to be colored.
Right.
And so even if it's sort of like, this is the wrong shade of green, this is not how I wanted this, the art is, I mean, you would speak to this better, right? But you draw differently if you know that it's going to be colored.
Right.
And this was just so clearly drawn to be black, white, that's it, right? I mean, and it's so compelling to me. Do you know I meant to look this up, and it was a crazy week. We're recording this ahead of time. Pope Leo the 14th was elected this week, so I spent, half of the week watching a chimney and the other half reading, translations of articles in various other languages that I don't speak, and scrolling Twitter, and also praying for the Pope. But do you know how does he do paint and brush?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, there's definitely some stuff on here that is not, it looks like he'll add some details with like a nib. But he's mostly brush work. And he's a master of it. I think that's his line is like probably one of the most flawless, like, lines out there. And that takes a lot of work to kind of get the amount of just technique, and it gets better actually as it goes. I think he really, I think I hate, so not to look too far ahead. I think his art kind of peaks like 2/3 of the way through, to me, but, there's points in here where it's just like, yeah, just the brushwork is just so good. Very in that kind of Walt Kelly pogo style. But even just elevating that, I feel like, in some places, it's just so good. But yeah, to answer your question, brush for sure.
Yeah. And also part of what I think distinguishes Bone, as you were indicating, is what it's reaching for, right? So Pogo is great, and I love Pogo. Pogo is also, silly stories, wordplay, characters getting into hijinks, and that's all present in Bone. But Bone wants to tell a sort of action adventure story along with it, and does so really well. It's a story that, like, this sounds funny because Bone is unequivocally a comic book or graphic novel. It is not something that could be pulled out of that art form, right? Any more than you can sort of have a Mona Lisa as a movie. But at the same time, I think we've all had the experience of reading a comic book because of the art and thinking the story is not very good, but the art is compelling enough that I'm turning the pages and I'm keep going, right? I would be interested in Jeff Smith's art if it had no story, and I would be interested in the story of Bone if it were just a novel.
Interesting.
Yeah, and
I wonder if I were to.
Like, it's much better as this,
right?
Sort of obviously, but that he, and especially that he sort of seemingly came out of nowhere, right? He didn't. Obviously, he'd spent decades working on drawing and doing his own strips for, a college newspaper and trying to sell his strips and doing writing and all this stuff. But he seemingly came out of nowhere. This dinky little self-published book. That, I agree. Everything about the comic continues to improve from the beginning, and but even so, like, it does feel like they've come fully formed, right? Thorn, and Boney are all themselves from page one. Thorn, when she's introduced, Thorn. Rose, Grandma Ben, is Grandma Ben, even though, like, these characters, particularly the human characters, grow in depth over the course of but it's sort of clearly all present in the author's mind from the beginning, and it feels like they all jump off of the page immediately in a way that many other series take a while to really figure out who their characters are.
Well, that's an interesting, I totally agree. I think the interesting thing about that is this is kind of similar to Tintin. This is actually like the third iteration of Bone. This is the third time he's introduced these characters to the public. And so kind of the backstory behind this is Bone started as like a Jeff Smith. If you look into just kind of his history, he'd been drawing Bone since he was a little kid. Like the especially the three Bone cousins he'd been drawing them since I think like 12 years old. Like there's very crude drawings, not crude in a gross sense, but childlike drawings where he's working on these characters. So he's had them kicking around for a while. And then in college, he had Thorn was a comic strip that he drew, a newspaper comic strip for his college newspaper. And you can get that. We may cover this on a Patreon episode, the actual Thorn strips, because they're really interesting. And then even after that, he kind of relaunched Thorn about halfway through it, trying to get it to a syndicated deal. So these and it's interesting how much has changed and how much does not change between these two strips. Most of the plot is actually kind of there up to a certain point, and even a lot of like the jokes and sequences and all the dynamics in a much rougher form. So I think this does feel incredibly polished, incredibly well formed when it lands. But there was, I want to say decades of actually just not even developing his skills as an artist, but just like telling this story in his head and kind of refining it and working out the kinks. So I think that's one of the advantages he does have here is that, this is something that and kudos to him for continuing to just going back to this well, because it eventually really paid off, but it wasn't an easy, an overnight success, I would say.
Yeah. Do you think we want to start on issue 1?
Yeah, really quick before we jump in, I think one of the things I just wanted to call attention to with his art is the fascinating thing. And I have in our show notes a page because we just got done with Jack Kirby, right? And I just pulled kind of a random page out of the Fantastic Four Galactus sequence, and then I pulled a random page kind of out of one of the issues we were going to read here, although we are not actually going to cover this one. But the really fascinating thing to me about how Smith puts together sequences is how locked down his perspective is. Like if you look at Kirby, every single panel he's optimizing for the most dramatic, the most dynamic way that he can communicate what's going on. So it's very intense. It's very dramatic when you look at it, but it has a weird distancing that he does from the characters. It's great. It's very action oriented, but that's what I'm talking about when I say that, Jeff Smith is pulling from a totally non-Kirby tradition. I would say that if you look at Smith in a comparative kind of sequence on a page, the perspective is like really, really static. Like you could be standing in the room with these people watching this scene play out, right? It's very just, you do not change perspective at all. And what that actually does is that allows your eye to focus on the individual characters. So the dynamism and the visual interest actually comes from the transitions between each panel, how the characters are reacting, their expressions. So you're not being jerked around to all these different perspectives. It's not disorienting at all. And it allows these people to have like a much more kind of, the characters are much more expressive, not the action. You don't go like, oh wow, this is just so cool looking, but it's drawing you into the characters. And that, like, it really reminds me of like Charles Schultz, I think, or another artist who will have these very static compositions where hardly anything changes panel to panel, but the thing that you're looking at is actually the expressions on the characters' faces. And that creates way more humor and kind of feel like engagement on a different level than a lot of superhero comics ended up doing, kind of following the Kirby tradition. So no knocking on Jack Kirby, but I do think that's one of the things that makes Bone so appealing is just the way he puts together his pages. Like if he drew this like a Jack Kirby page, it would be totally different and not very fun to read, really. But by choosing to follow this much more like kind of Schultzian style, you get all this little nuance to the characters, and you can pick up on their emotions and the dynamics of the situation. That's a really appealing way of doing it. It's inspiring for me just looking at it.
It's so funny. So while you were talking, I opened the book up. Just it fell open to page 304, and in the two pages, the quote unquote camera
Mm-hmm.
is just in the same place. There's one
Right.
where it's zoomed in, and then other than that, it's just so first panel sort of establishes where you are. Second panel is zoomed in because phony has something. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 panels where it's three characters standing in almost the exact same places, uh, interacting with each other. And but each face is just so communicative, particularly the three protagonists, or the three Bone brothers, rather. Bone cousins? Wait, brothers or cousins? Sorry, cousins.
Cousins. Yeah.
The three Bone cousins, who, I feel bad for anyone, as we've been talking, who hasn't yet read Bone, just because they haven't read a great work, but also because you have no idea what we're talking about when we said three Bone cousins. So we'll get into that in a moment. But their faces are just so expressive. And then it's only with the last panel that you then pull way out and they run off and there's some sort of action. But the whole time as you're reading it, you're pulled in, you're there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That
It's
comparison to Kirby is great, I think, because Kirby
yeah.
is so, I mean, it's just always moving and showing you different ways of approaching every single scene. And it does make, as you were saying, like there is a sort of dynamism to it that like is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think Smith's sort of use of perspective as sort of here's where you are, you're watching mostly.
Yeah. And
Just
that's why I think
yeah,
for me, like Jeff Smith, like it's funny because I have the Art of Bone book, and there's never like a page where I'm like, certain artists, Kirby included, but there's a lot of artists I'm going like, how the heck do they do this? Like this is so crazy. And I never have that with Smith where I'm like, I don't look at something he's drawn and go like, how did you even do this? It's the sum of what he's doing that is so impressive. It's combining all these things and the choices he's making in each moment that I think it makes him such a great cartoonist and one of the best because of it's in service. It's not like just a guitarist shredding, it's like picking just the right things every single moment. He has such good instincts on that front.
yeah, absolutely. First issue.
Yeah, let's dive in.
So as we indicated, Bone was published as individual issues. So it was a monthly comic that took a few breaks as it went, and then it was graphic novels had sort of started. So the one that he was particularly looking to in terms of success was Dave Sim's Cerebus, because you would publish a bunch of issues and then put together, one of these. Here, I have it right here. One of these sort of phone books of 25, 10, 15 issues. And so he was sort of looking to that success, but he very intentionally sort of, I think from the beginning, structured each piece of the story into 5, 6, 7 chapters, and each one became one of the volumes. Oh, and also those volumes, right? There are 9 volumes. They got sort of separated into 3 parts of the story. So the first is The Valley, or Vernal Equinox. The second is Phony Strikes Back, or Solstice. And the third is Friends and Enemies, or Harvest. So they each have sort of one name that's kind of very approachable, right? The Valley, Phony Strikes Back, Friends and Enemies. And they have a secondary name that is sort of temporal and related to, kind of movement of the stars, motion of the seasons. And, as we hopefully eventually cover the whole thing, we can kind of think through that a little bit. But I think it's fair to say that part 1, The Valley, is the lightest, the most comedic. It's setting things up, helping you get to know the characters, the place where they are, the situation, and introducing us to mysteries and threads that we're going to pull on over the course of it. The
Right.
second becomes much more dramatic, becomes a bit more intense, and then the third is just this when it really reaches a sort of epic pitch. Sorry, I'm just looking at the table of contents, just thinking about how good that is. So anyway, the first issue out from Boneville begins with just this great shot of these three strange looking guys that will very quickly learn are called the Bone Cousins, out in the middle of a desert. And you have one sort of short one, Phone, who's really going to be our protagonist. Then tall, skinny, I don't know, Groucho Marx-esque, I don't know what you call him, Smiley. And then the only and then Phony. And Phony is looking very self-pitying sort of towards the reader. And we're introduced to each of the characters. And I think it's fair to say Phony, pretty quickly we learn, was the richest bone in Boneville, which is a line and a term, right, that gets sort of used throughout. That, of course, now having read lots of Carl Barks, I realize is partially a kind of tip of the hat to Scrooge McDuck, the richest duck in Duckville. But again, like we were saying before, traditionally individual talent, it works whether or not you recognize that. So he was the richest bone in Boneville, now ex-richest bone in Boneville. Smiley is just kind of a goofball who's always smoking cigars. And Phone is just kind of the everyman, I think it's fair to say.
And he seems to be the kind of the youngest too, so he has kind of that youthful, in a sense. I mean, it's not really clear how old the Bones are, but he's kind of the most guileless. He's not an idiot at all. But And
I'd be interested to hear, Levi, you talk about how from the beginning Smith's really effectively, but effectively distinguishes between these three Bones, because it'd be easy, I think, for them to kind of mush together, but they're all really distinct immediately, in ways that also I think kind of fit with their personalities. So I'd be interested to hear you kind of talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, even in the design, I think because the Bones are Phony and Phone are they're about the same size. There's slight differences to their face that you can kind of, they're subtle, but they're there. But their designs are similar. Smiley's more easy to distinguish, and Phony wears a T-shirt with a star in his chest. And that's kind of he's always wearing that. No real context given for why they've chosen the outfits, or why Phone Bone doesn't seem to wear any clothes. Kind of the same rules apply as the Ducks, it seems like, as to their get-ups. But yeah, their voices, and really I think their voices are so distinct as well. They all have their own kind of personalities that really shine through immediately here. I think, Phony Bone is, he's kind of like Uncle Scrooge on his worst day. Maybe if Uncle Scrooge didn't have his own moral as his own personal standards of actually working hard, he's like a kind of sleazy Uncle Scrooge. But he also has that kind of what Uncle Scrooge does when he loses all his money and he's just wallowing in self-pity, kind of weeping and just complaining and hating the world. Really reminds me of Phony Bone. But and Smiley, I think, he comes across as he's clearly kind of a comic relief, but I don't know. Their dynamics just work so well, and it's clear that this is where I think Smith has been writing these characters for so long that he just knows how to kind of play them off each other in funny ways. So immediately you're sucked in to this whole situation, and it's kind of clear who's who. Just the expressions they have on their faces, the way they look at each other, the way they roll their eyes or react to each other. The dynamic just like kind of instantly works. Then it's a great introduction. Even just so great example for me is this little exchange they have where Smiley finds a map and they're lost in the desert. They're running out of water and stuff. Phony wants to give them. He's like, "Save, give me the map," and stuff. And he's like, "Give me $1."
Well, and crucially, right, they already had a map, and
Right.
Phony says this is a crummy map because it doesn't show where we are, and Phone says there aren't any bigger maps. This is the entire known world.
Yeah.
Right. But somehow Smiley has found this map.
Right. Exactly. So he demands $1 first. And he's like, no, I don't want to give him $1. And he's like, we're lost in the middle of the desert. Give him $1. Then he gives it to him, and it's like something like a little kid is drawn, and it's like, oh, this is worthless. And he's like, it's worth $1. So it's like just these little, these little jokes and these dynamics that they have between them is just kind of immediately works and is fun to read.
Yeah. And so then, as they're fighting over the fact that Phony gave him $1 and now he wants to kill him. They start hearing a zzz sound that's getting louder, and Phony asks whether it's the townspeople, who we learn have basically wanted to ride Phony out of town on a rail because of some sort of huge scam that he's just pulled on the whole town, which we'll find out more about later. But it's not the townspeople. It is I don't know what you call a group of locusts, but it's, hundreds of thousands of locusts flying through. And Phone and Phony freak out, start running off. Smiley is just fascinated. He's just got a big grin on his face, just watching them come through, and then they all start running. And they fall off a cliff. There's some great sort of comedic stuff here. They're screaming. And I love the lettering here.
Mm-hmm.
The way that Smith letters both the Z's of the sound that this massive collection of locusts is making, and then also the way that they scream, and you can tell it's sort of getting louder as the letters get bigger. I don't know. That lettering just sticks out to me.
Yeah.
And then you have this joke: whatever you do, don't stick out your tongue. Yeah. So keep running, falls off a cliff, and Phone finds himself at the bottom of a cliff, really, down in a gully, and he's yelling for his cousins, trying to figure out where they are. And we see this very ominous set of eyes inside of a cave open up, and I'll just say is our very slight introduction to, I would say, I think it's fair to say one of the 3 or 4 most important characters in the book, but right now, just a big set of eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Phone climbs his way back up and realizes that he climbed up the wrong side of the gully. And he has no real way back except for, because, you have to climb all the way back down, but he sees a cigar butt, which tells him Phony is there.
Or Smiley in this case, yeah.
Or sorry, rather not Phony. Sorry, Smiley. You're right. So Levi,
and I do think the turn that he does here it's a good indication of their kind of relationship, because especially Phone and Phony Bone, they're polar opposite characters, right? Where Phony is sleazy and kind of will do anything for money. Phone is much more he's more moral. He's more, like I said, guileless, and often is just totally exasperated with his cousin's behavior. But they also have each other's back at the same time. I think that's one of the things that
they clearly love each other.
Yeah, it's a very much a family relationship of, like, there's frustration but not hatred. I think is a good way of it. And this is a good example of it, where he's like mad at him the whole time, and then, like, as soon as he realizes he's lost him, he's like, "You got to help me, save me," and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a nice dynamic, and it never feels their whole relationship. I think that's one of the enjoyable things is the dynamic between the 3 of them in this book, because it just strikes the right notes. It's never mean-spirited. And kind of seeing Phony's, like, behavior is hilarious a lot of the time, but it never feels like, to me, it never crosses a line into something like, oh, that's just kind of ugly, even though it gets close to it at points.
I think phony. Well, we'll get there. We'll talk about that more
Right.
as the series goes on. Yeah. I'm not going to say more there. So, do you want to summarize the next little bit?
Yeah. So,
I didn't mention at the very end of the page, we see the top of the head of whatever it is that has that pair of eyes, and in silhouette, you're just seeing a bit, and he looks almost sort of donkey-esque. I think it's fair to say the way that you're laying down.
Right.
Yeah, but you continue.
Yeah. So Phone is following the cigar butts, trying to find his cousins. He beds down for the night. It's getting dark. In the middle of the night, two creatures appear, which we'll later find out are called rat creatures. They're looking for the one with the star in its chest, which we've already seen, and if we're paying attention, we would connect with Phony Bone. They're going to kill. It's not Phone does not have the star in his chest, so they're going to kill it to eat it, to kill him, to eat him. But then at that moment, we get our first glimpse of the red dragon, who immediately scares off the rat creatures, and Phone awakens and thinks doesn't really know what's been going on. The red dragon asks him to light a cigarette. He does.
But it's completely dark, so Phone does not see him.
Yeah, he doesn't see him. He thinks it's Smiley's talking to you. And so he lights a match, and he's face to face with a huge red dragon and freaks out, thinks he was dreaming. And basically continues on, wakes up the next morning, continues on, kind of unaware of the whole situation, unsure if it was a dream or what happened, and reaches the valley on the other side of the mountains.
That shot of the valley, which is going to be where we spend pretty much the rest of this 1,300-page book. I love this shot where you have this minuscule Phone Bone just looking out at beautiful forested space. And he says, "Cool, I've made it. That stupid map was right. Yes, sirree, Bob. There's water in on the menu tonight. I can kiss Smiley Bone for finding that map. I might even kiss Phony right before I strangle him." And then he finds another one of Smiley's cigar stubs, gets very excited, and then introduces a character who I wouldn't say he's a crucially important character, but he's a character that I love, Ted the Bug.
Right. Yeah.
Who actually here, how about if you read Phone and I'll read Ted the Leaf, and we'll just read through this a little bit. I don't know why.
Okay.
But I think this will be fun.
So you're starting at the top of page 33 here?
Yeah.
So he says, "And look, one of Smiley's cigar stubs.
Hey, watch it. You almost stepped on me."
Whoops, hello, what are you supposed to be?
"I'm Ted. I'm a bug."
You look more like a leaf.
"A leaf? That's an insult. Where's my big brother?"
Hey, hold on. I didn't mean any harm. Besides, what could your big brother do to me? Whoa.
And then suddenly this massive thing, 2 or 3 times as big as Phone, that also looks like a leaf, says, "Is you picking on Ted?"
I just said he looks like a leaf.
"What are you, a troublemaker? We don't need your kind in our valley." "I guess you didn't mean no harm, big brother. You don't have to hit him if you don't want."
Listen to him. Listen to him.
"Well, okay, Ted. If you say so." I don't know why, but that scene just that scene, it just kills me, and it also gives us an indication of kind of the strangeness of the valley that they've landed in. But it's also very cartoony, right? Because as we sort of indicated, it's going to get in certain ways more grounded, and in other ways less so. But just the introduction of Ted, I don't know, just the comedic back and forth, I think, is one of the highlights of Smith's writing, because you just get these and we talked about when we read Understanding Comics about the ways that cartoonists sort of mimic mimic the timing you would have in a stage play or on a TV show.
Right.
And I just think Smith's sort of comedic timing in the way he lays out the panels, particularly with the way he sort of sets the camera, so to speak, and just the way that he changes things between panels, is some of the best I've ever seen.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it's one of his strengths that.
Yeah.
I think maybe Charles Schultz does it similarly too, but it's not as, I don't know. Yeah, man, because he's on that level of really capturing just the expressions combined with like the comic timing and poses and
that differentiates him a bit, because I do, my sense is he learned from Schultz some of this, but also he's doing it on a 2-page canvas. Right, every time you open up, except for the first page of each issue, when you open up a page of Bone, you have 2 pages before you, right? And most of the time, Schultz in Peanuts just has a few little boxes for a strip, or a bit more for a Sunday, right? But he's sort of laying out the timing of 2 pages every time, and I think he sometimes, when I'm reading him, gets me to sort of, as I'm working through these 2 pages, laugh, and then laugh again, and then laugh again, and then laugh again. You know what I mean? Like he'll sometimes have these comedic pages where you're getting like 4 or 5 genuinely funny bits and interactions that just, if they work for you, just work.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's, on the very next couple pages, we're reintroduced. I think they're the same 2 rat creatures that we saw the night before, who got chased off by the red dragon. And they have they immediately want to eat Phone Bone. Because, I mean, one of the things I would say is, if I was a predator, I think the bones would look delicious. We would always joke with our little kids. It's like, they look like little bones because they're so soft, and stuff. But like, but yeah, so they want to eat Bone, but they want to turn him into, one of them wants to turn him into a quiche, which immediately creates a huge debate between these 2 rat creatures, because a quiche is not appropriate for monsters. One gets offended because they were called fat, and it's kind of a little squabble that happens, which gives Bone the opportunity to run off. But these 2 pop up all through the series. They're very much like, additional comic relief, which is funny because they're essentially the monsters, part of the team, the monster team of the story. But they are, I think these 2 rat creatures are some of the funniest characters that he
they're
has.
Just sort of a Bert and Ernie. That's not the team. I don't know what team I want to compare them to, if they're an Abbott and Costello or
Abbott and Costello. Yeah, but they have that some kind of dynamic like that.
Yeah.
Where,
and I think possibly the funniest to me running joke in the comic is the way that the one rat creature just always wants to make quiche. Like, yeah. I don't know why that gets me every time. I know it's coming, right? Because I've read this a bunch of times, but that always gets me somehow. And I think that is something. I think it's really hard when writing to calibrate when a running joke can work and when it can't. Because it's really easy to develop a running joke that just gets grating.
Right.
But at least for me, the quiche bit, it comes back over the course of it. But right, because it's a 1,300 page, I said 1,000. 1,300 page story. Like you've almost forgotten about it, and then you see them, and you sort of think, I wonder if there will be a quiche bit. And then when there is, like, it just, I don't know, it always works for me in a way that I could see that kind of a joke very easily becoming annoying. Yeah,
he does have a good sense. I think the thing that sells it to me with these 2 is their expressiveness. And the rat creatures, I think, are really fascinating because they can look really scary sometimes. Yeah, and they can also look totally hilarious sometimes too. So they have a real range. There's a real emotional or like kind of range to the rat creatures that I think Smith kind of gives to all his characters in general. But the rat creatures are just a great example of it to me, because sometimes they look like, your typical monsters, huge teeth, big jaws. And then other times they'll just be just emoting in ways that are totally hilarious.
Yeah.
And so they come across almost more like, as the series goes, like kind of dumb dogs, you know what I mean? Like in a good way, like in the sense of like, a dog can look really scary sometimes, but they can be really cute at other times. So
Yeah.
the design he landed on for them, which took a little work, I think, but is really fantastic.
Yeah. So I'm wondering now, we said we were going to cover the first 2 issues.
Yeah, maybe we should just do the first,
I
because
think
we're
we
out of
might
time.
just want to finish the first.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone who's a longtime listener will know that this often happens to us at the beginning of a series, because there's just so much to cover. And also next time, I'm sure there will be more, because we'll probably get a little bit more into sort of the history. But I'll finish off the summary of the tail end. So I forget if we mentioned, but Ted and his brother have told him, that he's got to get out of the valley before winter, because once the winter comes, there's no chance of getting out. 2, that he should find that Phone should find Ted's friend Thorn, because she knows everything. Phone is running, trying to find Ted again after getting separated because of the rat creatures. And he hears water, and he's extremely glad because he finally gets to drink some water. What am I going to do? What if I can't find my cousins before it snows? We could be trapped here for the whole winter. I got to get out of here. This forest is too weird for me. And you hear rumble. And this doesn't sound like high praise, but it is when you remember how big this book is. This is probably a top 25 page for me in the whole series. When we'll put it in the show notes, but when you have Phone just sitting by a tree, and you see this giant, I don't even know what you call it, sort of whole, foot of snow up in the air, just come down, whump, and then you see the entire valley is covered in snow, and it's snowing. About half of Phone's sitting body is covered. He's got a bunch of snow on his head, and there's a little hole where he's sitting, and he just says, "Case in point."
Yeah.
I
Great way to wrap up the first issue.
I think this is just such an effective first issue, because it
Mhm.
it introduces us to these characters who are straightforward to understand.
Mhm.
And they're also, visually speaking, very easy to identify with, particularly Phone, right? He's sort of a Tintin-esque character. He's like we talked about when we read Understanding Comics, by simplifying features, it often becomes easier for readers to kind of see ourselves in the characters. So you have this easily identifiable character. The situation that he and his cousins are in is, interesting enough, and then gets into the valley, and it's just sort of, what is this world?
Yeah.
Where his cousins, who is Thorn, right? And I think one thing we haven't really talked about much is that Bone is sort of self-consciously kind of an all ages graphic novel. It gets a little darker towards the end. I'd say, nothing a 10 or 12-year-old couldn't handle. But it's not like it's sort of horrifically violent or something. Oh, it gets dark. But it's not really having people die, but it's not having sort of intense violence.
Right.
People are romantically interested, but it's not having sexuality depicted. And it's not, and it's, there's pretty clear good and evil. It's not kind of deconstructing very much.
Nope.
And I think that it would be much less effective if it were starting with the character we were going to meet in this episode of the podcast, but now we're not, because we are taking too long. But Thorn, right? Thorn is a great character. Thorn is also a more complicated character, I think, than Phone, and a less sort of immediately identifiable one.
Right.
And so I think it actually works much better that we start with phone. Additionally, even though the Bone cousins look very different from human beings, uh, in certain ways their lives are much more like Boneville sounds a lot more like 20th
A
century
modern
America.
city. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
whereas the valley is this strange place with creatures, and we'll see it's almost like a medieval world. Um, and and I think by structuring it this way, we're coming into the valley with these characters, with particularly Phone, who we can identify with, um, and we are as interested to understand the valley as he.
yeah. I think that's one of the things that is so fun about Bone. It's such a good example of what kind of an indie comic book can do. Because if I put on my like stupid Hollywood producer hat, I'd be like, well, what are these Bones anyway? Let's make him a teenager so he can like fall in love with the girl and and stuff like that. And we're gonna refocus it. It's like there's all this weird stuff that like you kind of take for granted reading it, but it's like, yeah, what is a bone? What where are these? What is the logic of this valley and the world they're in and stuff? But it's like, yeah, he can just do what he wants because it's his own story. He's writing it. He's making the rules himself, and in that sense, it's super original. And a lot of things that you wouldn't think would work actually are way more effective than if Bone was a like 18-year-old boy or something like that. It's a very original and just kind of unique way to tell a story that just you immediately get it. Just the first issue, it's not even a rough start. It's great.
Yeah,
it comes out of the gate at full speed.
yeah. I have so many more thoughts on Bone, but I also don't want us going on forever. Particularly because a lot of my thoughts I need more plot elements before I can articulate them well. So do you have any kind of closing thoughts?
Other than that, I think this is, I had it's fun with, I've read this book to my kids. This actually is a great read aloud book. One of um, the things that I appreciate about Smith is he has zero inner monologue, but a lot of external monologue, generous with the external monologue,
Hmm.
very zero inner monologue, which makes actually a fantastic way to read a book out loud. And so I think this is a great book for all ages. I just recently there's a kid I go to church with, and he loves comics. So I'm getting to be like, oh, well, you should borrow. I introduced him to 1010 about a year ago. I'm like, hey, have you read Bone? He's like, no, and I was like, okay, I'm giving you Bone, And so it's one of those that I just love, just giving to people because I know if you enjoy comics at all, if you enjoy reading it at all, it's just such a great story, and um, it's something I recommend, pretty wholeheartedly,
Yeah, it's
to young
something.
readers.
Last weekend, I had the chance to introduce a friend to Star Wars for the first time.
Oh wow.
He's in his late 20s, somehow had never seen Star Wars, so we watched episode 4. And I recommending Bone is similar to that, where it's just it's so good and it's so itself, and it's also so
Mm-hmm.
indebted to so many traditions. Um, that it's just a joy to bring people into it.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that, yeah, similarly, I give a kind of wholehearted recommendation. And I just think everybody should just like, regardless, if you're unemployed and penniless and find yourself with $40, skip a few meals and just get the like hulking one volume black and white edition because it's better than any meal you're gonna have. Like it's just it's wild to me. Like, especially given, I mean, something that we try to stay positive generally, but one of my big kind of bugbears about the contemporary comic scene is that it's so expensive. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's just
Yeah.
like, I mean, I get that they're expensive to produce and everything. I understand there are reasons why, but like there are so many comics that are just in principle inaccessible to most kids, certainly. but even like most adults without tons of extra income. Bone, like, you just throw 40, maybe the new printings are like 45, I think, but like $45, and you have just this whole story that's amazing and it is just so compelling. Or I guess if you're unemployed and homeless and have $40, maybe you get meal, but go to the library and try to get the black and white ones.
Should be able to find it at the library.
Because the black and white ones really, just read it. Like, it's, I think probably, yeah, along with Tintin, of the things that we've covered so far, it's the most like, just get out and read it. Even people who are not particularly comics people, I think Bone is a really good graphic novel to give to somebody as who's kind of skeptical of comics, to get a sense of how good they can be.
Agreed.
Yeah, so I highly recommend it.
Next week I think we'll continue our discussion of Bone. We didn't really make it.
Are we gonna finish the first sort of volume, or just do a few more issues?
That is a good question. I don't know. What do you think?
I think maybe there's just so much that goes on in the first volume. Let's try to finish the first volume, and realistically probably won't. How about if we?
Maybe we can make better time next week. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. But keep reading Bone if you are reading along. So I think that's all for our episode today. If you enjoyed this episode of Truth Beauty Comics, there are 3 things you can do to support the podcast. The first is to just keep listening and tell your friends about it.
The second is to review the podcast, giving it 5 stars wherever you listen to it. The last thing you can do is to consider contributing to our Patreon with a monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can get perks like access to exclusive episodes, voting on upcoming episodes, and even an original drawing from me. But most of all, you can help make this podcast sustainable.
And as Levi indicated, I think we might be doing a Patreon exclusive episode about the early comics by Jeff Smith. So if you're interested in that, get on the Patreon. That's the end of the episode. You can reach us at truthbeautycomics@gmail.com or on our social media accounts. Thanks for listening. Remember to take comics seriously and have fun while doing it.